my experience with the big companies is not necessarily that they were more objective. That's been a surprise in my career. And I've sometimes wondered, why do we spend so much money if at the end of the day we hire on our gut feeling? We were very unsuccessful with experienced people. And I think the gut worked less well with people with longer CVs than it did with people with no CV. I mean, you're not the brightest person in the room. You never are. And that was so exciting to have team members that are more intelligent and more experienced. Will it really augment us rather than help us make the same mistakes faster?
We are live on the Objective Hiring Show. Today we're joined by Jo. Jo, thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to be here, Tim.
It is our pleasure to have you with us today. And where I always like to start is just to hear a little bit more about the guest. Who is Jo? Who are we speaking to today?
I actually thought about this question, and I think what best characterizes me is that I'm a starter in things, and I've started a number of things. I've started my own business, which was a data company way back in 1999, kept that until 2012, and then merged it with Deloitte Consulting, where I was a partner in the field of Deloitte, in the field of analytics. I then moved on to become the first chief data officer of BNP Paribas Fortis, which is our biggest retail bank in Belgium and in Europe. And I did that for 6 years until 2022. And from that point on, I've rebooted Data Merit, restarted Data Merit. And I'll give you a scoop. There will be a newborn company before summer, focusing on solving and getting people started on difficult transformation tracks and getting them through their first 8 weeks.
Okay, that is exciting. That is a scoop. And can you tell us the name of the business yet, or is it still under wraps?
No, it's this phase where the copywriters are working very hard. So I'll keep that for June.
Okay, keep that under your cap. We'll have to have you back on again in a few months' time. Then maybe we can discuss that business once it's up and running.
That's why I'm not telling you now.
Okay, excellent. Very tactical. I like it. Now, you alluded to something in introduction there that you'd worked through creating your own business from scratch through to working for these enormous worldwide companies. And so that's a really interesting lens, one that I personally don't have. Like, I've tended to work in SMBs or startups, and so I don't have that wider picture. How did you approach hiring differently for your own business in those early stages in particular versus in, a huge multinational?
I think the biggest, my answer would be counterintuitive. You could think that the big businesses would be more objective and that the small business would be more subjective and founder gut feeling or smart team gut feeling. And my experience with the big companies is not necessarily that they were more objective. That's been a surprise in my career. That was really a big surprise for me to see that happen. And I've sometimes wondered, why do we spend so much money if at the end of the day we hire on our gut feeling? Of course, there's a big pre-triage or a big triage that's happening in those companies. And that's where that process is relevant. In the small businesses that I've had, you're not faced with the problem of the triage. And there it was more of even very unknown people, because they don't know you, you don't know them. And I must admit to picking out very, I think, talented people during interviews. I even have one example of a person who gave up his study program. He's now a very successful entrepreneur himself. So that was a very intuitive and subjective process with a lot of mistakes, I can tell you. So if I would have to go back, I try to be also more objective in the small businesses.
You mentioned the triaging challenge in larger companies. You mean just because they're dealing with like a high volume of applications?
Oh yeah, it's huge. Like so if you would go to France, and it's the mother and father's dream, or it used to be until not so long ago, the mother and father's dream of having your child work for BNP Paribas, for instance, because it's such a household name, and such a reliable brand name to the people. And so the amount of candidates is just huge. The same would be for Belgium. If you would take a big four consulting company, would be very much the same. So huge number of candidates, and the objective triage process is, or let's say the industrial triage process is very important.
And you mentioned even though it's almost like there were objective steps involved, but at the end of the day, it kind of came down to just that more gut feel. Was it that the objective measurements were almost ignored if at the end of the day someone thought we should hire X?
No, I think I might have exaggerated that a little bit. It's not like I think 95% remained in the process, which was quite objectified, because you let people do tests and give them assignments and really test them and dry run them quite thoroughly. It was just new to me that you get this 0.5 or this 1% of people sneaking into the process for not an objective reason. That's what I wanted to say.
And you also mentioned that when you ran your own business, perhaps looking back, you should have been a bit more objective in your hiring process.
Yeah, I think I relied too much on my gut feeling, and that was quite unsuccessful with people with experience. That's remarkable. When I ran my own business, we were successful in recruiting young talent out of school, had a very high rate of retention. If you look at those people today, many years later, almost all of them are very successful on their own. So that was a very good batch. But we were very unsuccessful with experienced people. And I think the gut worked less well with people with longer CVs than it did with people with no CV.
Wonder why that is. Is that because they're better interviewing, like they're more compelling, they can craft a better narrative, and they that kind of thing?
I think so. And they were all coached by recruiters and headhunters. And so I think the extra layer of coaching and preparation. So you do a better interview, but doesn't necessarily make you a better future colleague. And with the inexperienced people, it's very much what you see turn out to be. What you see is what you get.
That's interesting.
And that's why I said maybe if we would have had more objective techniques, we could have seen through that. I'm not sure. But of course, for a company, and if you're a startup, you hire like 5 people a year. You're not setting up an analytics machine to do that.
No, you're not. And also, the problem is at that scale, I would have thought one bad hire is really bad because such a high proportion of the team. Like, do you ever feel like, yeah, you hired someone who, without naming any names, of course, someone who like threw it off course? And you're like, oh my God, this is really hurting us having this person here.
Yeah, but I think what we did quite well is be decisive when it didn't work out. And we always said the health of the team and the structural health of the company is more important than, let's say, the cost of wrong recruitment. So I think that was a wise decision. And we never dragged on when it didn't work.
And you're hiring people. This is in Belgium or France, I'm guessing, or
Yeah, I think the startup was recruiting people in Belgium, Big Four company, and BNP is obviously has a wider range, which was actually quite interesting. And those two experiences and those two companies also taught me the power of diversity. It might sound as a cliche, but I'm convinced it's not. Because in those environments you had access and to a much broader variety of people. And it starts in Belgium with a variety of languages, and then it goes on to Europe, and those companies being global, you get a much broader range of people. Let's say I once did an Indian dance at an event with a group of very well appreciated Indian colleagues. So that's still a recording that's out there somewhere.
I'm going to frantically Google for that after this call. I hope it's less cringe than the one Indian dance I've done, which you reminded me of now. I was lucky enough to go to my friend's wedding in Mumbai about 14 years ago now. And this is like the full Indian wedding, 2,000 people there. It goes for a week. Like, it was crazy. I was the only non-Indian, so I stood out like a sore thumb, as you can imagine. And at some point you have to kind of enter if you're in the groom's parade or whatever, and you do a little dance. And I was well out of my comfort zone, I can assure you. So hopefully it's before the days of smartphones. That might not be out there. Yours might be a little bit better than mine.
No, mine was with smartphones. I saw smartphones going up and I broke into a sweat like I've never sweated before, I think.
Well, it's the effort that matters, I'm sure. They appreciated it.
Yeah, the symbolism, it turned out to be an important dance. It created a bond. That's probably what it's for anyway. So,
back to this hiring between, let's say, a startup or your own business and larger companies, is there any other big differences? Like, because when it's your baby, it's your business, like it matters more. Like, no matter how professional you are and you're in a massive company, of course you care, but it's not quite the same thing. Did you find that change your decision making? Or maybe you're like, I don't know, more risk tolerant in a bigger company because it was kind of less riding on it? Or did you think about hiring in any other different ways like that?
There's a few other differences, such as sometimes you need to hire someone that at first sight you wouldn't, because sometimes people you're hiring, but you're not hiring fresh from the market. You're in an internal system, so you're presented with internal candidates, and so your choice is limited. That could sound like a disadvantage, but in those two companies, I also learned that hiring above your own level of competence into your team is really a very powerful thing. I think another mistake I made as an entrepreneur, as a previous entrepreneur, I'll try to avoid that mistake in the current phase, is that you tend to think that you're the smartest. I would never have admitted to that, but in retrospect, maybe that's what it was. If you're in these big companies, and in particular the bank, I've never been confronted with so many bright people. And it's more in the bank than in a consulting company, strangely, because consulting company hires for pyramid, which also has a sort of this principle ingrained that everybody that's not a partner must be more junior and therefore less experienced, lower rates, and therefore less valuable. It's very subtly ingrained that you're sort of on top of the pyramid. If you're in a big European bank, I mean, you're not the brightest person in the room. You never are. And that was so exciting to have team members that are more intelligent and more experienced. And the only difference is they might not have chosen or not have had the luck to get into this political management position, but it has nothing to do with their experience or their competence, which might be much more sophisticated than mine, which was much more sophisticated than mine was. And I've so much enjoyed that situation. So that's very different. Not the hiring down thing, but really hiring.
And so you mentioned that in your early entrepreneurship efforts, you didn't quite appreciate this. You didn't hire beyond yourself or beyond your own skills or reach.
That's a reflection of an aging man, probably. But I think it was never the design. But if I look back, I think it might have been. One funny anecdote, if I may, is that an experienced team member that we hired with experience at a team event explained to me that soon computers would be connected by the internet and all processing would be done in data centers and no longer in the company, and that this thing would be called the cloud. And I laughed it away and I said, that's never going to work. There's no cable that's big enough to do that. And so that's one of my epic mistakes to illustrate the fact that you should not think that you know better than your team. You should hire smarter people than you are.
Yeah, and I guess as an entrepreneur, that must be one of the key levers that you have to grow is if you hire really smart people who are, you kind of keep increasing the average skill of the team. Is that one way to think about it?
Yeah, and one of the things with the whole thing about objective hiring and AI and hiring, that's one concern I would have. Like, is that going to be reinforced? Or is the AI going to drive to more to averages and similars and further automation? Will it really help us transcend ourselves as human beings, or will it just automate the deficiencies that we have as human beings because we've trained it from human being behavior? I think that's a question that's still very much out there. And will we appreciate it if it does counterintuitive things that we wouldn't do?
Great question. A counterintuitive thing that we wouldn't do, or maybe that the average person wouldn't do. So maybe an out of the box thought that a slightly crazy, I'm not sure if they're a genius or a fool kind of person might do. Would we appreciate that? Yeah, maybe not. But I do get the sense from using AI that it's very middle of the road in most of its stuff and thinking, but good. That's a pretty good effort if it can answer a question about anything at 80% of a level. But yeah, maybe it's not going to give you a completely different insight.
Yeah, and I think it comes from the fact that a lot of the debates about AI, also in the context of recruitment and human resources, if you do some reading, it often tends to go to increased productivity, but it's like really increasing the productivity in the middle of the bell curve. And so I think the added value is really, what does it do in the outliers? Will it be better at detecting really exceptional talent or avoiding really bad mistakes rather than just faster processing the bulk? And I think that the whole efficiency debate is not the most valuable one.
Yeah, I agree with you. And if I think back to I don't know, more than 100 people we've had on this podcast, I've asked them about AI and hiring. Most have pointed to things that are kind of outside what I would call the core selection process of deciding who we're going to hire. It's more like, oh, it could help me, summarize my interview notes, or I can write a job description more easily, or we could schedule interviews with candidates automatically and these kinds of things. But yeah, that's not really, hiring's pretty broken at the moment. I feel like there's bigger problems that maybe it could help us solve. What do you think? Do you think it could be used to actually decide this is the right candidate, for example?
You mentioned one. I think the whole logistics and scheduling of appointments and rescheduling because people can't make it and the interviewer is not available. I think it might seem silly, but I think that's an efficiency area that's pretty huge. I think you need to meet people, you need to have contact. So that problem comes in. So whatever technology can do there to help, I think would be very helpful. Also because by this being an inefficient process today, you miss out on some people that some people get away because you lose them during the process because they take other jobs or anything. So that's, I think, a valid theme. But the more valuable theme, and I think that's for AI in general, again, the focus, or generative AI or the new forms of AI, the focus is so much on efficiency and not enough on, will it make you do things better or differently than what you do today? Will it augment you as a recruiter? And augmenting is not efficiency. Augmenting might be even counter efficient. It might say, we've seen 6 candidates. We need to revisit 2 of them. They need to come back for an interview, which we hadn't scheduled because I'm in doubt. Your gut may be convinced, but me as an algorithm, your augmented recruiting buddy, I think there is significant doubt and there might be a potential there. Once we get to those applications, then I think we're talking real value. I'm not sure that it will ever get there. You could do the same argument with AI in coding or any other human process. Will it really augment us rather than help us make the same mistakes faster?
Yeah, I feel like personally the limitation more at the moment is on the demand for that rather than the supply of that thing, because at least from all the people I've spoken to and all the conversations I've seen, I don't feel like talent acquisition teams, they're thinking, hey, like, we really need a tool to help us make better decisions. They feel like they already make perfect decisions. It's all under control. They just need to automate away some of the bullshit so they can do more of their decisions. So I'm struggling to see where the cut through is going to be, unless it's maybe big tech companies who already have a very structured way of hiring, where they hire at scale, where they have thousands of people, where they put them through these hoops and they've done the research as well. Maybe they're the ones who might adopt some of these new methods and roll them out, and then they might kind of filter through into other companies after that, perhaps.
Yeah, but I think we can fear that the industrial setups, that they will just use the new technology to improve their industrial setup, which I think is mainly in the pre-triage, not in the final stages. And the question is, if anything, in many sectors, AI should give capabilities also to companies and in fields where there was no industrial capacity to automate and to do science before. If it's one thing, it should be able to do that. So I'm not so worried that Microsoft and Google have recruitment factories and scientific methods. It's what can we do for all for the rest of the market that normally wouldn't have access to its own HR scientists and researchers and stuff like that. I think that's where the gold is, and the question is that it's not there. It's not so often an efficiency play, but it's really a better decision making play.
Yeah, and I don't think the technology is. I feel like it's not even the limitation at the moment. Like, if you had a new applicant tracking system which had, I don't know, a native integration with Claude or ChatGPT, and you had recorded every interview, you've recorded every email, every Slack message with the candidate, the hiring manager, everyone had filled in their forms, the AI had been present for every interaction, it would be in a great position to say, hey, like, you're having this conversation to discuss these 3 candidates, which it's also listening to. You've mentioned this thing about the candidate, but actually they proved that wasn't a problem in this interview. Here's the note, because it's going to have this perfect memory that we don't have. So I feel like it's just getting access to the data, recording it, kind of maybe like a new wave of HR tech, which has the AI implemented by default. And then maybe some of these things will start to come to the fore, because I just feel like the companies aren't necessarily going to be demanding this, though. Maybe that's one thing. They're probably not asking the HR vendors, hey, help us with our decision making.
No, I think one area that could be useful, certainly in areas where there's scarcity of talent, is using AI to help look for adjacencies and likelihood. Traditionally we've had traditional HR systems and HR information systems for many years, and they were very good at comparing sort of rule-driven, does this person have this skill or not, in an industrial way, and then we do the triage. One area that could be useful is now making that more intelligent and saying, okay, this person might not have the immediate exact skills to tick the box, but there's a strong adjacency in this and this field, and there's a high likelihood that you can transfer from this and that a human operator or a traditional rule-based machine might not have noticed. And I think our problem is going to be in finding the right talent. I'm biased because I live in a technology world, and talent is not abundant. And if there's a good application of AI, it might be that getting people on board that at first sight do not tick the box, but would have the potential to do so.
That's a great use case. And as you say, yeah, maybe the more brute force, logical, rule-based things would miss that in a way that a large language model might pick it up. Also, though, to be fair, a traditional recruiter, someone in talent acquisition, is not an expert in any of these fields either. I feel like that's a big bit of the problem, personally, that we're asking people who are generalists to somehow do screening and expect to know about a data scientist and a software engineer and a marketer and all these other roles that they've never done themselves. Whereas surely a large language model knows a little bit more about those roles than they would.
Yeah, and indeed, and the systems are around. And I think another challenge is what I learned when I did some university research is two old authors. We go back into the 20th century. Tversky and Kahneman said people are bounded. We have bounded rationality. There's only so much rationality that we can have as human beings, no matter how much analytics and reporting and tests we make people do. The problem is the limitation of us. Let's see whether AI can help us augment our bounded rationality and not just repeat our bounded rationality 10,000 times over. That is what we need, I think, that we have a system that is more rational and less bounded than our brain is. And again, the question is then, will we follow it? And I'm wondering, as long as we are in the ultimate decision position, will we ever see the real added value of AI? Because we will always, if we're always at the end of the day bounded by our own human rationality, then will we get to the full potential of it? But those are philosophical questions, probably.
Well, it's such an interesting topic, and one that I've thought about so often in the last 6 years, because we'd always push this narrative ourselves of like data-driven hiring, use metrics to make hiring decisions, focused on the data, focus less on your intuition and gut, which can lie to you at a certain level. And we dealt with, over the past 6 years, so many analytics and data science leaders. So people who their whole day job is using data to make better decisions about product, marketing, sales, operations, whatever. Yet I'd say 90-something% of them, at the end of the day, for hiring, for people decisions, they would just go back to their gut. And I could not give any report to any hiring manager in the world that said anything about hiring a candidate that they don't want to hire for whatever reason. And so I've often thought this myself, even running the business. I'm like, oh, am I my worst enemy sometimes in hiring? Like, should I actually just let go and just let the machine decide for me at some level? But I'm not sure many people think that way.
I guess there's also a big problem of having data, as in, I recently did a very good hire and it didn't work out. I thought I would be doing a good hire, very enthusiastic about it, started well, but didn't turn out well in a team. But that data of that thing not working out and the learnings from that doesn't exist. That there is no data collection recording why that it went wrong, why did it go wrong. So neither the human beings, only the human beings who were involved in that case will remember. And by the way, one of the lessons is next time we need to do more rigorous testing. So you see, the hiring mistake led to more scientific approach. But other than that, it's nowhere in the official memory. So
Exactly. So we don't really track, as you say, bad hires, the reasons for it. There might be multiple reasons. It's not just one thing, like multiple things might have gone wrong. The person might have had an issue in their personal life which changed. The onboarding might not have been perfect. The company got restructured. Like there could be so many different things. And you're right, that just kind of evaporates into the ether. I think almost other side of the coin problem is be pretty rare that companies would have a good definition of what success is, because is it staying in the job? Is it passing probation? Is it in the same job for 3 years? What happens if you stay for 1 year and move to another company and get a promotion? Is that success or failure? Is it binary? Should it be a metric? Until we figure that out, I guess we're going to be a little bit stuck.
only dramatic failure is visible.
Yeah, and we can all remember those. I'll share a couple of quick anecdotes. So I'll tell you, the first 2 people I ever hired as a hiring manager, which was 11 years ago now. I was a senior analyst hiring an analyst, and this is my fault completely. So they quit because I overpitched the role. I said, "Oh, we've got all this cool data. We haven't measured this before. We haven't looked into this." Da, 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 da. What I didn't say to them was, "Yeah, that's all true, but the first 3 months is going to be Excel hell bullshit. You're going to have to automate some reporting, and then we can start to do some interesting stuff." So I kind of glossed over that little very important detail. And so the first person rocked up, quit on the Friday of the first week. He's like, "I'm out of here, man. You can have your spreadsheets." I was not a very fast learner though, because I went back to market, repeated the whole thing again, spent another month hiring someone, got them in, they quit on day 2. Okay. And then I finally realized, hang on, I'm doing something wrong here. And I was a bit more honest. And randomly, I was sitting there at my desk, having just had the second person quit, and I'm doing this crappy work that I wanted someone else to do, basically, demoralized. And I overheard someone behind me chatting to the HR people. He happened to be in there just for 1 day doing some filing on like a temporary contract. And he mentioned something, Morgan Stanley internship. And it's just like my ears just pricked up. I'm like, oh, okay, interesting. Like he's probably clever at least. Pulled him into an interview room, told him about the job, hired him as an analyst right there and then. He stayed in that company for 10 years. So, so my other takeaway is even, what is it? A faulty clock is right twice a day, because you can just kind of take a punt and sometimes it works anyway. Yeah. But yeah, we should work on getting more sites into hiring. I feel like there's such an upside for AI in hiring in so many different ways, especially I think in that initial triaging, screening stage at the kind of application level, because I think it's so unfair at the moment. I'll give you an interesting stat. So there's been lots of different studies in different markets around the world where the researchers get thousands of different applications, split them into groups based on the name on the application, like the ethnicity of the name, and then apply for jobs and measure the callback rate. The University of Sydney did this in Australia a couple of years ago. They tested Chinese sounding names against Anglo-Saxon sounding names. Cut a long story short, if you apply to a job in Australia with a Chinese sounding name, you have only 1/3 the chance of a callback as an Anglo-Saxon name, like for like resumes. So like that's disgraceful. That would be like, if I were a Chinese, I would be very annoyed that that's just the systematic bias that exists. So I struggle to imagine how even a poorly implemented large language model that's filtering and screening those CVs, measuring how well they match against the JD, I struggle to imagine how it would be as unfair as the typical recruiter in Australia. What do you think? Am I being sort of overly optimistic, or?
Well, it's an interesting, and I fully concur. And I saw the difference of working with Belgian recruitment teams, and then the European scope, or which was much more French inspired, and France having a totally different relationship. Historians would not always call it positive, just like the Belgians, but with Africa. But the workforce was much more African, working in Paris, much more diverse. And so it was really shocking to go back to Belgium and not having the same level of diversity. And then you see and it's not AI doing that, something is creating a different workforce here. And it must be human, because it was not AI. I think the million-dollar question is, which AI and which algorithms are we really using? Certainly the European lawmaker is focusing strongly with the EU AI Act on making sure it's transparent and unbiased, etc. But I always keep thinking, what's the norm for being unbiased? Because the norm is often very biased. So I think it's really a difficult topic that I don't claim to master. I don't know how we're going to solve it. Are we going to, suppose you have 1,000 CVs and you have a CV screening system, and there's this one CV, there's this one candidate that decides, I'm not going to write my CV like all the others tend to do it, because they've all been generated by another bot by now. So I'll stick out, is the AI algorithm going to find him or her, or disqualify him or her because he's not in the middle of the bell shape? It will need to be, if I were an HR director and I would get such a system, I would so test it, because it's going to be either one. It will pick it out or it will throw it away. You need to understand, if you bring in such a system as an HR director, you need to understand what your system is doing and be conscious of that and say, okay, we're going to lose all the original ones, or okay, we're going to prefer the original ones. But you need to understand your system. And my critique to the people in the AI community, and I'm sort of one of them, but I try to keep the feet on the ground. Critique to many other people is, stop presenting this thing as magic. It is computer automation. It is automation, and it is based on probability. And you cannot escape your duty to understand what the automation rules are. Even if they are called AI, it is automation. It is programmed differently, but at the end of the day, you're automating stuff just like before. And so you keep that moral duty of understanding what your automation pattern is. I think for me, it's a huge pattern how people have a distorted image of AI. I think the intelligence word in there is really creating a huge misunderstanding.
It's a misnomer, you think?
Oh yeah, because it's automation. It should be called DP, differently programmed software or something, instead of AI.
I think it's right that we expect transparency and that there's not just these black box systems running around making decisions that we can't scrutinize. But I also feel like, well, yeah, but what we want to be careful with also is not expecting too much, or realizing that, hang on, the base case is the way humans do it, where if you were to ask a company you'd applied for a year ago, why did my resume get rejected? Who rejected it? What was their logic for rejecting it? No company in the entire world could tell you that. There's no transparency at all in the current system. But with any kind of automation, there is at least the possibility for, because it does a certain set of rules, and then it can record those and share them externally, internally, what have you. So at least there's the opportunity for transparency. Whether or not companies would want to ever disclose that themselves or not, I doubt it. But at least there's the potential for it. What I worry is that we are so fearful that we miss out on an opportunity to improve the current scenario by comparing AI to some perfect scenario, as opposed to the current scenario, which I think is crap.
Yeah, but that's what I've seen when I was in the boardroom. Um, it is very counterintuitive for business executives to say that a new technology might hold the potential to do things better than what they have done forever so far. I dare you to find the brave executive to stand up in a boardroom and say that they exist, obviously, and they probably exist in the successful companies, but there's a huge majority that will not make the case against themselves. Because you need to make the case against yourself. And I think that might become a differentiator in which companies are successful in the future and which are not. And I come back to my point, the ones who only make the case for automation and efficiency, that's an easy case to make, because that's just saying, I'm doing things right. The only thing I need is do the right thing faster and cheaper. But standing up to a crowd and saying, I think we've got this wrong, and this new technology holds a promise of doing it entirely different, that requires some courage.
Courage that you feel is often lacking.
Courage that is often lacking, yeah. That's why courage is courage.
Because it's rare. Not everybody has it. Yeah. I wonder if actually thinking about it now, hopefully, sometimes doing a startup, because stuff changes all the time, you kind of make stuff up as you go, you create a new product out of nowhere. You're often failing at many things, especially in the early days. You kind of slapped in the face with your own, limitations as a founder. Maybe that makes us slightly more open-minded to this revolutionary technology making us better as opposed to just automating our perfect way of doing things.
Yeah, it's because your agenda is not it's not self-perpetuation. Your agenda is reinventing yourself, your product. By design, I think as an entrepreneur, your agenda is to change up until a point where, well, not up until a point. You are aware that you need to keep changing. I think that's different in a corporate agenda, although a board would never admit to that. They will say exactly the same thing collectively, but there's a behavior that's individually different. I had one interesting lesson at some point where I saw a very important decision with very long-term repercussions being made, and me being the only, let's say, computer analytics, AI person in the room, being sort of flabbergasted at the simplicity of the technique by which we were taking that fairly mathematical decision. And I questioned a very appreciated colleague after that, someone that I hold in very, very high regard. And so I was curious, and I said, why did we tackle this problem so intuitively? Because would you agree that this was really a perfect case to use some analytical or mathematical techniques? And he says, yeah, I understand what you're saying, and obviously I know the techniques, but would the decision have been, would the outcome of the decision have been different? And wouldn't the process have been more complex because the people in the room who had to decide would not have understood the process, and the outcome would have been different? So what is the added value of the point that you're making? That was a very confronting point of view. And for me, in my mind, the jury is still out. Was this an extreme example of wisdom or of short-sightedness? I'm not sure. And the decision was one that will last for 40 years. So we'll tell in about 30 years, probably. I might not be around to see the effect of it, and he might not be around to see the effect of that intuitive decision. But that's really Tversky and Kahneman full out, bounded rationality. We cannot deal with rational decision making, so we'll use the gut instead.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to the AI implants. I reckon I'd sign up to be a cyborg in 5 or 10 years once it's safe. I'd get that little chip in there, get me direct access to AI and the web. How about you? You up for that?
I've always been a gadget man, so I probably would. Uh, and if I can share another small anecdote, at some point about 8 years ago, we're in a discussion about AI in Paris, in the banking context. And we're actually having the discussion whether we should invest in AI and thereby contribute to this potentially um, life-threatening technology. So that's actually a discussion we had. Should we invest in AI, and are we then not contributing to our own demise? And another appreciated colleague, Mark from Luxembourg, actually killed the conversation by saying, look, people, the only purpose in the universe is the perpetuation of intelligence, whether it be biological or mechanical or silicon. It doesn't matter. We are just transient. And I have never been in a meeting with so many bright people philosophizing and having a conversation stop dead in its tracks. And so we said, okay, that's sort of is it a depressing idea or not? But yeah, I don't think we can escape investing in AI. So we did.
Well, I for one welcome our future overlords, and I hope they're nice to us and they can listen to our podcast here. We're very pro AI. We love you guys.
Yeah. Look how cute those podcasts were.
Yeah, exactly. Back in the old days. Uh, Joe, it's been such a great conversation today. We've taken it in many different directions, and you've offered us some great insights and wisdom. So thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thank you for kicking off my day in a very energizing way, Tim.